Welcome back to Urban Farmer. We have another very awesome guest with us today, a very knowledgeable subject. His name is Meeks. Meeks has a degree from Cal Poly in agriculture and plant science with a concentration on commercial greenhouse production. He's also a moderator at the Dank Den and a member of the Cannabis Roundtable. These are credentials that call for a very high level of education. We're very privileged on Urban Farmer to be talking to Meeks today and to be able to hear some of the biological aspects of horticulture as they pertain to cannabis and cannabis growing strategies and just good old-fashioned experience. How are you doing today, Meeks?
Good, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on the show. We definitely appreciate it. Tell me a little bit about your education from Cal Poly and what you went through to earn that degree.
Well, actually, it started with falling in love with plants, and that started when I was on a farm in Hawaii, and I watched a lot of people go through transitions in their life, and plants helped them through that. The art or the science or the experience of working with plants seems to be really healing. Not even interacting with cannabis, I'm talking just any plants, a garden of any kind, and that's what inspired me to get into it in the first place. And then it was sort of my age and what my friends were into at the time, I would say, that drew me towards cannabis. And so I put two and two together and I said, well, I think I want to work with plants, and I think that there is this industry evolving around cannabis as I saw it legalizing over the last decade. And I decided to go to school for horticulture, and I ended up at Cal Poly. And with that, as soon as I got out of the dorms after my first year, I started to grow in my closet in my bedroom. And I learned a lot off the forums. And I was in school for horticulture, but I was learning from the forums because cannabis is this different plant, and you need to learn from the people that have done it before. And so for my first year of growing, in my second year of college, I basically took all my knowledge off one forum, THC Farmer, and I learned a lot from some of the guys on there. And I'd say this guy, I think it's Trichome Farmer, it's been so long, but I saw some of his pictures, and he was putting together a brand new grow room, and he had everything decked out in white paint, and it was so perfectly designed because he had been a grower for a few years, and that really inspired me from there to expand my garden quickly after I moved it into a 2-car garage. And that's when I started applying my degree to it. Taking what I was learning in my classes and mixing that with what I was reading on the forums. Sometimes I would realize, man, what I read on the forums was totally ass backwards. And sometimes I would go, hey, how come I'm hearing about this in the forums all the time and we don't talk about it in my classes? And I would actually go, talk to my professors after hours and find out, of course, well, we're just covering the basics in your first few years in your classes. And it took until my later years till, yeah, basically everything is very parallel in the horticultural world for any plant to what you read on the forums. And a lot of things have been translated with a different name, but there's a lot of the same stuff in, those giant greenhouses growing tulips, growing roses, growing any potted plant. And so that's when I started mixing the two, adding the education into my own garden at home for cannabis. That's a little bit about my schooling and how it interacted with my garden.
Getting the degree from Cal Poly shows you a cumulative perspective on horticulture, specifically with cannabis and the atmosphere and the environment. How important is this while producing medical cannabis?
Well, I think the atmosphere for any plant is definitely the main focus when you're growing. It's what drives the plant to pull up the nutrients from the pot, is the atmosphere around it. And so with cannabis and with medical cannabis, especially when you're thinking about a patient who might have a medical condition, using it because they're prescribing it for all kinds of things, even asthmatics. And so you want to make sure your medicine is clean and well grown and not full of harsh chemicals or anything like that. And so dealing with your environment first is going to help you not only grow a great plant, but also the healthier your plant is, the more resistant it is to things like disease and pest attacks. And so then you just guarantee yourself cleaner meds in the sense that your plant had its own resistances and you didn't have to tackle it with things like harsh pesticides, something like that, insecticides that you don't necessarily want to have on a medicine crop. because our crop is a little bit different than something like a tomato. Most of these herbicides and pesticides are rated to be used on crops that at a certain point before they're consumed are washed. And so you have to consider that, and that's why a lot of farmers turn towards reducing their foliar applications of things later in flower.
Those are all great examples of why it's important to have the correct environment to keep the plant in a healthy production state, to avoid things like disease and pest control, all those things. What are some of the specific details that make up an environment that's favorable for growing cannabis?
Okay, cannabis, again, and actually with that, I want to say that anyone who knows anything about growing any plant, don't treat cannabis like it's this magical, different plant. It is a plant like any other, and I think that's one of the problems in our industry, is that we talk about cannabis as this isolated plant, and it's so similar to so many other plants in our industry, in the horticulture industry, my industry, flower growing and ornamental plants, and other plants such as tobacco even, where there are less restrictions on home production of that, although it depends on what state you're in, I believe. I think we need to start talking about cannabis as a plant, rather than cannabis as this magical, mystic, isolated thing that you have to treat differently, and that will, in my opinion, loosen people's approach to it.
What makes up a amazing...
The ideal environment?
The ideal environment.
So that changes so much depending on the stage you're in. I would say vegetatively, I like to keep 60 to 70%. That's a really nice, healthy environment for the plant. It loves that.
Talking about humidity?
Humidity, relative humidity, because you always have to consider that your humidity is relative to the temperature. And that's why if you really want to get into the science of managing your environment, you want to look into vapor pressure deficit, VPD, and that's a combination of temperature and your relative humidity. And that way, if you talk about a number in VPD, you don't have to say, oh, well, what was your relative humidity and what was your temperature? And then do a little bit of translation in your head of what that means. You can just talk to growers in VPD, and then you instantly know, okay, well, even if I have a lower temperature, but a slightly higher humidity, it might be the same VPD. And so I'm getting the same reaction in my plants, the same draw on my plants, which is going to give me the same interaction with my nutrients. I'm going to be able to keep up the same watering schedule I'm used to. And so you can use VPD in your own garden to help you shift through climates. Different temperatures in the winter and the summer, VPD can help you get the same experience out of your plants. So you can keep your grow room dialed all year long. It can also help you communicate, like I was saying, with growers online. So when it comes to environmental management, I always push people towards VPD. But it's confusing to get into originally, because that's one of the things is cannabis growers have isolated themselves a little bit, and they always talk relative humidity. And if you go start talking to someone who's managing a larger greenhouse, their equipment is giving them a reading in VPD. And so that's how they're going to talk to you about the environment a lot of the time. And so I always push people towards that. That's one of the things that it took me 2 years of growing cannabis, and then I started applying, what I was learning in my classes to that part of it and saying, why don't we talk about it like this? Why don't we take notes in our journals like this so we can keep track of what's going on a little bit more accurately? And that was one of the things that I brought over.
Outstanding. What about the environment below the level of the earth, below the main stalk? So we just talked about the air environment. Let's talk about the root zone environment.
Okay, well, root zone environment is really important. A lot of people use a lot of different medias with growing. But the goal with all of them is to make sure that your roots have the water, the oxygen, and the nutrients that they need to be able to grow for a thriving plant. And so, if you're in DWC like MedGrower works in, you're going to want to make sure you've got your air stones to oxygenate that water, keep it oxygenated. Obviously, it's got the water access, it's growing in water, and you've got your nutrient solution in there. If you're in cocoa, it's got a really great natural composition that creates basically it creates pore space in there that traps oxygen in with your roots, and it also holds a lot of water. Peat does the same thing. Soils are tougher to work with in pots, and that's why they're usually amended with a little bit of peat in there or a little bit of cocoa to give them that higher water oxygen holding capacity. And in general, like you've already talked about with some of the other people, healthier roots, healthier plants, healthier roots, healthier fruits, bigger fruits. However you want to think about it, you definitely have to consider your root zone as important a part of your plant. I mean, that is the part of your plant you want to be managing as a grower, is your root zone. you want to take notes on your pH input, your EC input, your pH runoff, your EC runoff, and that gives you a real good snapshot of what's going in your root zone. And basically, if you have those figures to look at, you can easily diagnose a problem, because those are usually the culprits. And so you can just look back at your notes and say, okay, well, when did I notice my plant declining? Oh, and I also noticed that my pH drifted up, 0.4, and maybe that's the first thing I'm going to try when I try and fix this error. And that's one thing I want to throw in, is taking notes is probably the most valuable thing you can do as a grower. Not just taking notes on what you're learning, but literally just as much information as you feel you have time to write down about what you experienced in the garden that day, write it down. Because when it comes to the next time you grow that crop or that strain, whether it's the next harvest or 2 years later, you're going to want to look back on that and see, well, what went right, what went wrong, what was I exactly doing to potentially cause that? Because your plant isn't going to show signs of a problem for sometimes days, sometimes weeks. It depends on what medium you're in. DWC, you might see something you screwed up within minutes or hours. Soil, you might see something you screwed up at the beginning when you planted your plant. You might have screwed up how much super triple phosphate you put into that soil mix, right? And then you don't even notice that phosphorus deficiency until you're deep into flowering. And so sometimes you have to know exactly what you did the whole process to diagnose the issue. And that's why keeping good notes on what you do is going to be really important.
You spoke about the root mass earlier, and that it needed 3 things, and that was the oxygen and the water and the nutrient base. Explain how that ties in a little bit to the microbiology going on in a healthy root mass.
Okay, yeah, well, definitely if you're working with organics in your root zone, you're always going to also, with that, have the symbiotic relationship of a living culture in your root zone. Microbes that are feeding on those organic nutrient forms, and their byproduct, their waste product, is going to be the form of nutrient that's available to the plant root. Because a lot of people, I'm not sure if they know this or not, I guess basically as soon as you get into organics, you start learning about the microbes and how they process it for you, and how sometimes you want to be maintaining an environment for them so that they can help do their work better. But there are only certain forms of all the essential elements, whether you consider 16 or 18 essential elements. There's debate of which are essential and which are just supplemental. But those essential elements are only available in very specific chemical forms. And the microbes in your soil can help break down all the other random forms of that nutrient into the plant available form. And so there's a very symbiotic relationship there, because the microbes are also benefiting from some sugar secretion from the plant roots, especially if you're working with like mycorrhizae. They're attached to the plants and also feeding on to sugars from the plant. So
great, that was my next question. What is mycorrhizae?
Let's skip that one, because I'm gonna, yeah.
Sure.
Let's skip that one. Yeah. Well, because I could get into a little bit about it, but then my answer is really going to be that you want to talk to a pathologist, because my pathology is not nearly as strong as my degree being focused on managing the environment of the plant, and so it's more how much do you add to the pot.
I hear a lot of growers who are using super soil mixes use the sort of phraseology, feed the soil. You don't want to be feeding the plant, feed the soil. What are they talking about?
Well, like we were just talking about the microbes, they're breaking down these organic forms of the nutrient that aren't initially available to the plant root system. And so if you take care of these microbes that are alive, that are living in your root system, and you basically baby them the same way that you think about babying your plant, you provide them with ideal living conditions, provide them with a good pH that's not too acidic, a good root environment that's not too high in salts, too high in EC, maybe even augment your root environment with some sugars when you're looking for an extra release of nutrients from your super soil, something like a molasses, or I don't know, some of the sweet products that you've seen on the market. All those are really working with the microbes in your soil, and then they will help break down the organic forms of nutrients that you, I guess, have already put into your medium. Or if you're working with something like a liquid organic nutrient that you've just added in with your feed solution. But a lot of organic growers and the organic farming that I prefer are the ones like you were talking about with the super soil, where then you're relying on the microorganisms to be breaking that down for you at the right time. And the risks with that is you could set up your super soil wrong, and you don't know till halfway through your crop, and then your crop nosedives. But if you follow a grower that has developed a recipe that you trust, and you follow it to the T, then you can mimic their results if you also mimic their environment, which brings us back to what we were talking about earlier. The environment is so crucial to the results you get. It's not just genetics, it's not just the nutrients, it's not just the environment, it's not just the light, it's all these things. It's cleanliness as a grower, and it's also, as a lot of growers jump in and want to do too many things at once, I think. And I always recommend simplicity to growers, whether they're new or old. I think that simplicity in terms of how much labor you're putting in, simplicity in terms of how many inputs you're putting in, simplicity in terms of the records you're keeping, detail, but simplicity, not shaking the bottle and measured it with this plastic dripper. It's like, okay, well, what was the pH that you put in? What was the parts per million of each nutrient that you bottled or powder that you were using? And that's all you need to know for that type of stuff. What schedule was it? Actually, scheduling we haven't talked about, but scheduling is really important. That's one of the things that we learn in our classes, is to look at the finish date before you start, because you are sometimes 4 months away at your finish date, and you need to look at what you've got coming up in your life. We've been talking with a lot of people about having other things going on in their life, such as family, and having to manage grows around that, and scheduling, I'm sure for them, is a huge factor, because you have to look, oh, am I traveling to the Cannabis Cup, or am I going for a weekend with the kids or something like that, or do I just want to have this weekend off to myself? And so you have to be able to look at what date am I going to harvest, put that on the schedule, or when you want to harvest, and then track that back. Okay, well, so then when do I need to plant? And so outdoor growers obviously are really familiar with scheduling, but indoor growers could actually learn a thing or two from the scheduling restrictions that outdoor growers have, and just advance their own lifestyle, or help their own lifestyle, so it could be more organized that way.
Definitely. You've spoken a lot about keeping detailed records and accurate information.
Yeah.
What is, for a lot of people who just sort of try to remember what they fed the plant last time, or sort of draw on what they have for memory with what's going on with their plants, how would you recommend somebody get into keeping records? Maybe like a computer program, or just simple pen and paper?
It's all over. I've seen growers managing huge greenhouse operations, 100 acres plus, and their lead grower, what he does every morning is walk around with his paper notebook, and he takes runoff samples from every different greenhouse that he feels like is on a system that could have variability. Sometimes it's even every few benches. If it's a house that he knows he needs to keep an eye on the system, it has a little bit of variability in the house, and he just writes down pH runoff, EC runoff, and that's how he monitors his whole crop, and it works for him. I know other people that have crazy advanced $1,000 computer programs that they have trained themselves how to learn, because that's the first step with those computer programs, is teaching yourself how does this even work. And for some people that's a really great structure, because all those boxes that they ask you to fill in are things, oh, I didn't think to write that down, oh, I didn't think that might be important, and later on those people might benefit from having that information. So it really depends on working with your own experience and knowing what type of person you are. There's a type of person that can have the messy binder and it means they always lose their homework, and there's a type of person that can have the messy binder and that's just how they are, and they still get their homework in because they know exactly where everything is, they're just messy. Right. Not saying to have a messy grow room, keep it clean, but yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Definitely.
Know who you are.
Back to the living microbiology happening in a healthy soil medium. What would you say is the most common mistake that new growers get into when trying to establish the life cycle in the medium? What are some of the problems they do? Maybe just incorrect dosing of different elements, or patience even?
I think, well, if you're talking about new growers, the first thing they're going to want to do is test out their new nutrients they just bought, and their plant probably just sprouted. If anything, might still be a seed, and they're testing all their new bottles. And so you're going to burn the crap out of your plant. And so I would say be aware of start slow and work with the age of your plant. But more advanced growers learn that real quick. Once you screw up a couple plants, you learn, maybe I'll just start with water and see when it tells me it's hungry. And that would be the next thing. Is some growers work on this, oh, it told me I had a deficiency for this, okay, now I'm going to feed this. And when your plant shows you the deficiency sign, it is deep into that deficiency, to be honest. And so you have to take detailed notes on exactly what happened to lead to that deficiency, because you really want to prevent that the next time, because you don't want to rely on, oh, when it shows me the calcium deficiency, that's when I know it needs more CalMag, because it has already suffered from that deficiency. You've already had a loss of yield. No matter what you say, oh no, it still came out great. Like every time you see a deficiency sign, you have lost something somewhere. And so really you want to, don't beat yourself up about the deficiency, but you got to beat yourself up if you don't take good notes on why it happened, because you need to work at fixing that. And so one of the things I would say is reading your plant is great, but read it, take notes from it, learn from it, so that you can say, yeah, I'm reading my plant, it's all green and good. Because that's what that's when you start getting those, holy crap, that guy gets 2 pounds per light. Like, how does he do that? It's, well, it's because I, took notes and I got better from those notes.
Learning from our mistakes are most oftentimes just as valuable
Absolutely.
as our successes, and it's important that we don't ignore them and we treat them every bit as useful as a truthful.
Use your grow logs if you're posting online, videos, or I was a forum poster, so I was posting photos with a lot of text, but use those to document your grow, and don't hide when you fail, because you don't know who might be following you. Even if you're a real small person with a couple views, on some of my logs when I started off, I was not getting that many views. On one of the forums, they've amassed 500,000 views at this point, but I don't know how many of those people were following every detail I was doing, and so I always posted, oh, I don't think this recipe is working 100% for me right now. This is what I'm using, but if you're following my footsteps, just know that if you feel like something might need to be tweaked for your garden, try it out, because this isn't working 100% for me right now. And so, yeah, publish your mistakes, because everyone's learning from everybody in this industry, no matter what level of education you have. Like I said, even when I was in school for horticulture, I'm on the forums clicking through photos and learning from photos and information from other forum growers online that have learned from experience. And so everybody is following everybody in this, because it's also new. And I think it's really important that we all try and lead by example, and we don't try and hide the faults. We expose them and try and fix them,
Definitely. Why does Meeks use cannabis?
Recreationally and medically, definitely medically, I'd say actually. I suffer from anxiety and chronic knee pain in my left knee. I still have no idea what it is. I got a couple MRIs on it recently, but we're working on figuring that out. But definitely a social anxiety, and so I use it a lot for that. That's what I would say helped me get through college actually, was I would smoke before all my classes, and that helped me tune out what was going on around me. A lot of people say it makes you stoned and stupid, like you were talking about earlier, but what it helped me do was focus in, because my mind races all over the place, and it was almost like it made my classes more interesting, and the chit chat that could have been happening around me less interesting. And I ended up attending, like I told you when we weren't filming, I ended up attending every single one of my classes. Like I never missed a class while I was in college, and that was because I would just sit down, get high, and say, yeah, I'm ready for this. I know I'm going to learn something today. That's what I'm paying for. They will teach me something, and it's going to be great. So
that's very interesting, because like so many people say that pot makes you stupid. Yourself, a gentleman with a laundry list of academic accolades, to include this cum laude degree, which was at the top of your class, and you expressing that the use of cannabis actually allows you to harness a more valuable education that ultimately puts you as the top graduate at Cal Poly in their horticulture program. Very, very much an honor to have you on the program today.
It's been a pleasure.
Talking to you off camera has been a pleasure.
This whole cup has been great. I mean, the weather on and off, but everything about hanging out with everybody from the den. Also repping the Dank Den here, check it out. It's been awesome, met up with, I'd say, over a dozen friends that I've had for a couple years, met them for the first time in person, and it's been just fabulous.
Definitely awesome. It's a community unlike no other. The cannabis industry is lucky to have a guy like you, Meeks, that is such a credentialed academic and is going to be a large force field in preserving the integrity of our industry, and we're certainly lucky to have you. So if weed makes you stoned and stupid, this doesn't really fit the bill to me, so I think we can put that little misnomer to bed after speaking to Meeks today. So with that, we'll say thank you very much, sir. It was a pleasure. Everybody check out Meeks on the Dank Den. He's got a lot of informational posts.
Happy to help.
Send him a message. Great guy to talk to. Definitely can learn something. I hope I could have half the knowledge this gentleman has in his head. Till next time, this is Meeks, an urban farmer.
I don't know what the original question was. Hit me with the question again. But, and again, I've lost track of the question. With cannabis, hit me with the question again. And man, do I have a habit of sidetracking. You gotta hit me with a new question.